Good morning. What a wonderful occasion, how great it is to see this room full of people. And who else here besides me is a first-timer at RootsTech? We should welcome them. Come on, let's go. I feel like, between the Super Bowl of politics that is, amongst us and around us all this week, and the Super Bowl of football that's coming up this weekend, this feels to me like the Super Bowl of storytelling. And I'm very honored to be a part of it. I should say, I've come here today to tell you a story. It's a story that I've actually never really told before. So in the words of my 10-year-old daughters, I am nervous-sighted, meaning a little bit nervous and a little bit excited. And it's a story about how I came to be a person who talks so much about family stories. I wasn't always this way. I wasn't even always a storyteller. I was not a child prodigy genealogist, doing it from the crib. And yet it's become such a big part of my life. And so I want to tell you that story. So here goes. I was born in Savannah, Georgia. I am the 5th generation of Jews from the American South. That means I have relatives who fought on both sides of what my father still calls the War of Northern Aggression. In fact, as long as we're doing shows of hands, any Southerners here with us today? We're always a minority. No matter where we go, we're a minority. So I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, as I said, and I think what that means for me is that I had these two storytelling traditions, both the Southern tradition and the Jewish tradition that was sort of bubbling up inside of me long before I was even aware of it. We came here, my family took a trip out west when I was 12, and we came to Salt Lake City. And I remember 3 things about that trip. Number 1, that the streets were wide enough for a carriage with 2 horses to make a U-turn in, which, as you all know, is still true today. Number 2, we went to see the Tabernacle Choir in that spectacular space. And number 3, we went down into the basement of the research facility and we began to do some family history. But even then, I wasn't the one in my family who really latched on to family history as a passion. I am the second son, you see, and for those of you who may be familiar with your Bible, you know it's the first son who gets all the responsibilities and the second son who gets all the privileges, right? So Ishmael is the first and Isaac, he gets the birthright. Esau is first and Jacob, he gets the birthright. Joseph, he's the youngest son of all. So it was my older brother who became the family history person, and even then I didn't know that it would be my life's calling. So I graduated from high school and I left the South. I went north, I went to Yale. And I found in the process of leaving home that I learned more about myself as a Southerner and as a person by leaving where I came from and going to a new place. And so in 1986, I decided I was born in the age of discount airfare. I would go abroad. I would leave America and see if I could learn about myself as an American. And I moved to Japan. And I had a homestay family, and that first night, I was on my very best behavior, and I moved in with this family. They didn't speak a word of English. At the time, I didn't speak a word of Japanese, and they served dinner. What do? You serve your honored guests your best dish, and I was game. I was prepared for all the Japanese food, and then my homestay mother, she put down in front of me liver pie. Now, I would have eaten almost anything, but it was a little bit of a struggle to get through this liver pie. And I was very proud of myself. And then the next morning, I learned my first lesson about life in Japan, which is that breakfast is cold leftovers from the night before. So on day 2 in Japan, I was served cold liver pie for breakfast. And I got up and I wrote a letter home. And that began this process of writing these letters home that took me through the next 3 years. And these were a sort of, you can't believe what just happened to me today variety. And when I went back home a few years later to Savannah, everywhere I went in my hometown, people said to me, I loved your letters. And I said, have we met? And it turned out that my grandmother had I'm so old, these were written on crinkly airmail paper, right? And my grandmother had Xeroxed them and passed them around. They went viral in a 1986 sense of the word. And then I began to realize, well, maybe this storytelling thing is the right calling for me in my life. And so through most of my 20s, I traveled around the world and I wrote about my experiences. I wrote a series of books. I wrote a book about Japan. I wrote a book about Oxford and Cambridge. I wrote a book about country music based on the 2 years I spent traveling around with Garth Brooks and Winona and Waylon Jennings. And yes, it's true, I did spend a year performing as a clown in a traveling circus. And I have to say, it's very good that I have a timer in front of me, because if I started telling circus stories, we would be here all afternoon. I had in that year what I called the 7 circus sins: murder, rape, bigamy, bestiality, group sex, organized crime. If you find it in America, I found it in the circus. And then in the middle of that, so really sort of at the end of that experience, I decided to go visit a friend who was living in Jerusalem. And again, let me see a show of hands. Who here has been to Israel or to Jerusalem, to the Middle East? Well, on my first day, we just saw those beautiful images up on the screen. My friend took me on this tour to this promenade. And on my first day, my friend gave me this tour and pointed in the south, there's this controversial neighborhood. And then he pointed to that golden dome in the center of the city. And he said, that is the rock where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. And it just struck me. I mean, these are real places that you can touch and visit and feel. And I had this idea. What if I retraced the Bible through the desert and read the stories along the way? Actually, what I said to myself, which for a long time I didn't say publicly, was, what if I joined the Bible as if it were the circus and seek to become a part of it? Most people told me I was crazy, but I found this archaeologist, and the two of us spent off and on for a year making this journey. We climbed Mount Ararat, looking for Noah's Ark. We went down the spine of Israel, visiting all the places of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We went down into Egypt. We crossed the Red Sea. We spent weeks in the Sinai, and then we trekked up the banks of the Jordan, and we ended on top of Mount Nebo, where Moses dies overlooking the Promised Land. And I want to tell you one story, actually, that does capture that experience. And that is the most spiritual place I've spent most of the last 20 years of my life, going around the world, going on spiritual pilgrimages. And my favorite place of all the ones I've ever visited is deep in the southern Sinai. The Sinai is this giant wedge, this giant triangle of unoccupied land between Africa and Asia, 20,000 square miles of nothing. And in the very southern Sinai, there is a monastery that was built 1,500 years ago by visiting monks who said that one bush is the actual bush where Moses heard the voice of God. And they built this monastery there where they still have services 5 times a day in Byzantine Greek. So I spent a night in this monastery. On the side, I would go visit the burning bush. Okay, so it was very dark and kind of creepy, and I went down this staircase. There was a room with a crypt of all the skulls of all the monks who've ever lived in St. Catherine's Monastery. They spill out of this crypt like Cheerios onto the floor. And I go, and I sit next to this burning bush. So the burning bush, it's very tall. It's like a weeping willow tree. It's actually a raspberry bramble, which in fact is quite rare because it takes a lot of water to live in the desert. And the monks say it's been in the same place since Moses was there about 3,200 years ago. That's actually not true. They actually moved it across a small walkway so they could expand the church. Now, my guess is that some of you were on committees, maybe in your church or your school or your office or your community. Can you imagine being in the room where you had to take the vote as to whether to move the burning bush or not? So anyway, I'm sitting down there and I'm having this moment, right? There's this heat coming from the bush, and this heat, I'm going to have this transcendental, life-changing moment. And then I notice off to one side is a fire extinguisher. Now, at first I think this is an eyesore, and then I realize the unintended consequences. Is this in case the burning bush catches on fire? And if the burning bush does catch on fire, do I put the fire out, or do I look for the face of God? I'm very sort of discombobulated, and I'm not sure what to do. And this white cat with a brown patch over its eye looks out for me from this bush and screeches at me, and I screech back, and I go running back to my room and study my Byzantine Greek for the morning. I tell that story here to make a point, and that is, you can't understand the biblical story, I've come to realize, without understanding the desert. And all the most important breakthroughs in the story, whether it's Abraham leaving his family's house, going toward the promised land, whether it's the Israelites leaving Egypt and going into the wilderness, Israel leaving Jerusalem and going to be by the rivers of Babylon. The greatest breakthroughs occur not when they are comfortable, not in the best of times, but when they're in the wilderness, in the worst of times. And what I want to say to you, to all of you who tell stories, either professionally or as a personal passion, take your lesson from these oldest stories that have been passed down. Don't just tell the wonderful moments of your family. Find a way to delve into the most difficult moments. We are all connected to this story. And what I realized is that this was my family story. In fact, I'm working on a book now about Adam and Eve called The First Love Story that says all of our relationships have a model in this early relationship. I was in Israel a few weeks ago working on this book, and I met an archaeologist, and he said, think about this. There were 20 million stories in the ancient world. How many ended up in the Bible? Maybe 24? Think about how good those have to be. So what I want to tell you is when you're working on your family history and your family stories, run everything through what I call the campfire test. Would the stories work around the campfire? Do they have the emotion? Do they have the passion? And yes, do they have the pain in order to endure? So after Walking the Bible came out, I became this person who was traveling all over the world. I went back to Iraq and Iran and wrote a book about the second half of the Bible. I wrote a book about Abraham. I wrote a book about Moses that actually also got me deeply involved in Salt Lake City because of how deeply the Mormon story happens to echo with the story of the Israelites leaving the Promised Land, going into the wilderness, building this beautiful city where we're standing here today. And I was, for all intents and purposes, the walking guy. Until in 2008, I took a blood test that showed there was something wrong with my leg. And I had a scan and an X-ray and an MRI, and then I got a call from my doctor. The tumor in your leg is not consistent with a benign tumor. I stopped walking. And it took my mind a second to convert that double negative into a much more horrifying single negative. I have cancer. And suddenly, I was the walking guy who was facing that story I just said. I had had this life of green and of plushness with a nice career and a wonderful wife and young children, and suddenly I was facing the prospect that I might never walk again. That afternoon, I went home, and my young 3-year-old twin daughters came into the room, and they were doing this dance they had just learned in school, and they were spiraling and spinning, and they tumbled to the ground, laughing with all the joy in the world. I crumbled. I kept imagining all the walks I wouldn't take with them, the art projects I wouldn't supervise, the boyfriends I wouldn't scowl at, the aisles I wouldn't walk down. Would they wonder who I was, I thought? Would they yearn for my discipline, my love, my voice? 2 days later, I woke with an idea of how I could give them that voice. I would reach out to men from all parts of my life and ask them to be a part of the lives of my children. In effect, they could be my voice if I couldn't be my voice. And I decided to call this group of men the Council of Dads. And what happened to me in this moment is what happens to many of you in moments of pain or difficulty or hardship or dislocation is I wanted to record who I was. I wanted to write down what had happened to me. I wanted to tell my story. And so over the next year, as I went through this exhausting, horrifying year of procedure, which involved 9 months of chemo, and a 17-hour surgery in which doctors took out my left femur, replaced it with titanium, took my fibula from my calf and relocated it to my thigh where it now lives, and took out half of my quadricep. A surgery so rare, only 2 people before me had ever survived it. What I did during this year was I set out to write my story. I interviewed all these men about lessons that they would want to give from my life to my children. I interviewed my own father, and I set out to learn about the lives of my grandfathers, and other father figures in my life that I hadn't known. In many ways, it's what many of you are involved in on a daily or nightly basis. And what I learned in this experience is really the second thing that I want to bring forward and leave you with today. When you talk to people about family history, one of the things, at least that I hear most often is, oh, it's too difficult. I don't have time. The courthouse burned down where the records are. They got wet. I don't have the money to go back to wherever I came from. I can't get the whole thing. Both of my grandparents, when I went out to my grandfathers were dead. One of my fathers had left behind 22 audio tapes, which I translated and went through which I was able to learn. But my other father was not, he died suddenly, my other grandfather, he died suddenly and hadn't left anything behind, except for a collection of 3 volumes of epitaphs. He had devoted his life to collecting epitaphs, what people wrote on their gravestones. So think about this. Here I am, a man thinking in my 40s, thinking about dying, to find out that my dead grandfather had spent his entire life collecting epitaphs. So I don't have his whole life story, but what I have is this one interesting thing about him, and I could tug on that string. So what I want to tell you is, just as a writer speaking to as a storyteller speaking to storytellers, you don't need the whole picture. In fact, sometimes the best way to tell a big story is to tell a small story, and to tell it in depth, and to tell it in a way that you can find passion in, and somebody else can find passion and connection through your passion. So something else happened to me during this time that I was fighting cancer, and the 2 years that I was on crutches. Suddenly, I couldn't travel anymore, but I still had this curiosity, and I began to apply it to the home where I was. I took all this that I had, this passion and energy and enthusiasm and research and wanting to know thing that drove me for so many years, and I applied it to my own family. As many of you know, and as you just heard, I've spent the last 7 or 8 years involved in this exercise. I write a monthly column on families in the New York Times. I wrote a book called The Secrets of Happy Families that I know many of you have told me about as I've gotten to know you over Twitter and Facebook over the last few weeks leading up to this. And in a sense, I've been trying to answer a simple question. What is the secret sauce that holds families together anymore? What is it that makes some families effective and resilient? I've tried to know one thing. What is it that happy families do right? And what can I learn from them to make my family happier? I've learned a lot of things over the years that I've been working on this. I have what I call my list of things that high-functioning families have in common. They adapt all the time. They go out and play. They fight smart. But what I want to tell you here in the time that I have left is what I really deeply have come to believe is the one thing, the one secret ingredient that high-functioning families have in common, and that is they talk a lot. And not just the difficult conversations, as important as those are, but they talk about what it means to be part of a family. And what I want to do here today, in the few minutes I have left, is I want to shake you up a bit. I want to ask you to look at the family history from a slightly different point of view. I want to get you to upend some of your expectations and get you to look at this question from a slightly different angle. And what I want to do is I want to leave you with 3 big things that you can do on a daily basis to enhance your family, to talk about what it means to be part of a family, and to deepen the passionate engagement that you are all already involved in. Okay, so here are the 3 things that you can do to talk about your family on a regular basis. Item number 1, you can write a family mission statement. I talked to Jim Collins. Jim, as many of you know, wrote Good to Great, the defining management book of our time. And he told me that high-functioning groups of any kind, whether it's a company or a nonprofit or a religion or a family, they have 2 things in common. They stimulate progress, okay? They change, they adapt, that's what I was referring to earlier, but they also preserve the core. And he recommended that we go through this process of writing a family mission statement. And when I first heard of this, I thought, that's a little cold, that's a little corporate, that's a little corny. I can handle corny. I used to be a circus clown. I like country music. But then someone asked me a question, which is the question I want to ask you. You all are committed to family history. You talk about this a lot. If I went to the people in your family, okay, your children, your grandchildren, your cousins, your aunts, your uncles, your brothers, and I said, what values are most important to all of you? Could the people in your family, could they tell me? When someone asked me, I thought, well, I'd like to think they could, but frankly, they'd have to divine it because we've never articulated it. Sometimes we can be so involved in the facts and the figures of family history that we forget to pull out a theme and to draw the lessons we want others around us. So Jim coached us through this process of creating a family mission statement. If my wife were standing here today, she would say of all the dozens of ideas that I came home with that we tried in our family, that this is one of the top 3 most meaningful that we did. We gathered everybody together. We had the family equivalent of a corporate retreat. We had a pajama party. In fact, I had these striped pajamas from Hannah Anderson that I had never worn before. We got them all together. I learned that my kids had never they thought popcorn came from a movie theater or a microwave. So I decided to make popcorn. And sure enough, I burned the first batch. We were on our way to a memorable experience, right? And then we asked some questions. What do you like best about our family? Okay? When you're away from our family, what do you miss? When others come over, what do you most like to show them? And we had the most incredible conversation, and we ended up with a list of things that were very meaningful to be part of our family. Okay? We are not travelers. We're not tourists. We are travelers. We help others to fly. One of my wife's favorites. I don't like dilemmas. I like solutions. And then early on, one of my kids got into a spat at school, and we got summoned to the principal's office. Okay? Now we thought, oh my gosh, we have mean girls. What are we going to do? And we decided we had to do something. We brought my children into my office, and my wife, who runs an organization that supports entrepreneurs in 25 countries, she's a commanding person. She was totally stammering her way through this conversation. She didn't know what to do. She was not used to being called to the principal's office. This list, our family mission statement, was on the wall, and she said to my daughters, to my daughter who was there, do any of those seem to apply? And my daughter looked up and she said, we bring people together, and boom. Suddenly we had a way into this conversation. One thing we've learned from positive psychology is if you want to make yourself a better person, if you want to run a marathon or lose weight or write a book or cook a better batch of brownies, you have to identify what the psychologists call your best possible self. What this is doing is identifying our best possible selves. Who do we want to be as a family? Do we live up to this on a daily, weekly, or even monthly basis? Absolutely not. But it's there as a reminder. We've drawn the lessons from our family and identified them for all of us to try to live up to. So there's something you can do to make family history a daily occurrence. You can write a family mission statement. Next, you can do storytelling games in your family. Okay? Here's 3 quick ideas. Autobiography night. We know beginning at age 5, children can tell stories about who they are, but they need to practice. Okay? Researchers looked at American families and Asian families. And the Asian families, when they were telling stories about the day, they were focused much more on discipline and order and following structure. The American families were doing much more to tell stories. They asked what the psychologists call elaborative questions, that those of us in journalism used to know as who, what, when, where, how, and why. And they were pulling out these stories. And they went back 3 years later, and they looked at the Asian children, and sure enough, they were more focused on discipline and order and structure. And the Western children were more focused about story and who they are. Don't think this matters? Research has shown if your child or grandchild or anybody in your family has a big test tomorrow, maybe it's a school test, maybe it's a performance, maybe it's an athletic competition, maybe it's a big presentation at work. If you tell a story the night before a big event that emphasizes that you have done this in the past and you have performed well, it will increase your chances of doing well the next day. Storytelling as a way of building confidence, going back into your own history, can boost your performance going forward. Next, we know that when you travel with your family, if you tell a story while you're traveling, if you go through a museum and you're constantly telling, this is what we're noticing, this is what we're seeing, if in the end of a journey, of a family travel experience, you tell a story, you can actually embed the positive, resilient togetherness narrative that you want to create. It's not just that any trip will produce positive memories, you actually have to practice and embed those memories. We learned this, we do this thing now when we travel with our children, that at the end of every trip we write a short poem about what we did to try to capture those memories in their own minds and be able to have them refer back to it later. And then the last thing I want to say on this idea of making memories, especially we heard Steve earlier talking about engaging young people, millennials, and teenagers. use pictures. We know now because of cell phones that more pictures are taken every day than were taken in the first century of photography. So young people, it may not be the natural vernacular that all of us have, but young people are using storytelling more for pictures, and that's the way to engage them because they have this camera with them at all times. So do storytelling games. Tell your family history. And now the last thing I want to talk to you about, in the many years I've been writing about families, is the single most interesting idea. I wrote about this in the New York Times a few years ago, and it was the most emailed article for an entire month. The app Pocket, where you can save articles, of the 850 million articles saved the year I wrote about this, the article that had the idea I'm about to tell you about was the second most saved on the entire planet for the entire year. And the idea was this: tell your family history. Researchers at Emory, Marshall Duke, and Robin Fivish gave children a series of tests. They did this test first in the summer of 2001 with 4 families. And they asked them, do you know where your grandparents were born? Do you know an aunt or an uncle who had an illness that they overcame? Do you know your parents went to high school? What was happening in your parents' lives around the time that you were born? The children who knew more, who did best on this test, meaning who knew more about their family history, they compared these results with a raft of psychological tests. It was the #1 predictor of a child's emotional well-being and the belief that they could affect the world around them. It was the #1 predictor of a child's happiness. Why is it? What Marshall Duke said to me is that these children have a sense that they are part of an intergenerational self. A narrative that goes back deep in time, so that when they have difficulties, they know that someone in their family also had difficulties. And the #1 question I've been asked about this is, what about adopted children? Marshall Duke has 4 children, 3 are natural born, 1 is adopted. It has nothing to do with biology. It has to do with talking about what it means to be part of your family. I said this was done in 2001. At the end of the study came 9/11. And they went back and they tested these children again. And the children who had performed best were able to bounce back from that national trauma most effectively. And there's three narratives on families, as Marshall explained to me. There's what they call an ascending narrative. We came from nothing, we worked hard, we have a lot. There's a descending narrative. We have a lot, then there was a war or a recession or a storm, and we lost it all. Or there's what we call an oscillating family narrative. Your grandfather was the first in his family to go to school. He became vice president of a bank. Then his house burned down. Then his son also had a successful life, and his wife got breast cancer. The children who understand that they come from an oscillating narrative know that when they hit hardships, and they will hit hardships, they know that they can get through them, that they can push through, not because of what they saw in a movie or a book, because of people in their own family. So what I've been trying to say to you today is essentially 3 things. #1, take your story and ground it in the oldest stories that have ever been told. Go back, connect your story to your community, to your faith, to your school, to your company, to your country, to whatever it is. Connect your story to the oldest stories ever told. Second, find a way to make sure that these stories are not just something that are living inside the computers, but are every day. And the third thing is, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it with those around you. Do it at the dinner table, at the carpool, when you're taking a walk, when you're folding the laundry. Make family history part of your everyday. And this sounds easy, especially for all of you, because you've come to this event. But what I want to tell you is that it's harder than you think. Because our instinct is to protect our children and our family. We don't want them to know that we've had pain or there's been suffering in our families. We have to get over those instincts. We have to fling open our cupboard doors and in an age-appropriate way share with them the difficulties that we and our family members have survived. And so I want to end actually by making a request of all of you. 6 months after I wrote that article, after The Secrets of Happy Families was published, I got a call from my mother one day that my father, who's been fighting Parkinson's for the last 2 decades, was in a very difficult place. He was unable to walk, and he was losing the confidence and enthusiasm he had for the life around him. And my family does what we do in those situations, and we snapped into action. And my brother was focused on my father's medical care. My sister was focused on my mom. But as I've been saying to you, I've become the family storytelling person. And so I engaged in this process with my father, where every week I would send him a question. And we went through this process. It took almost 2 years, where I helped him tell the story of his own life and go through his life and find meaning by going through not just the joyful occasions, but also the painful ones. And at the end of this 2 years, we produced a book of his life stories. Now, I'm a writer, but I'm here to tell you my father had never written anything longer than a memo in his entire life. And this process was incredibly enriching. And it's part of something I've heard from people now all over the world as I've talked more and more about families. And so I am going to write a book about this experience I've had with my father doing family history. And I know all of you are on the cutting edge of this. You've thought about this much more deeply and for a far longer time than I. So I would like to invite you to tell me your stories. I'm very easy to get a hold of. You can find me on Twitter. You can go to my author page on Facebook. You can go to brucefeiler.com. Please tell me what you have found and help me tell this story of how we can help older people in our lives make family history part of their daily life. On the 1-year anniversary of my diagnosis with cancer, I went to see my doctor. His name is John Healy. By the way, Healy, great name for a doctor. And I said to him, "Doctor, if my children come to you someday and say, what should we learn from our experience, what would you tell them?" And he said, "I would tell them what I've learned. And that is, everybody dies, but not everybody lives. I want you to live." And so I come before you today, 50 years after I was born in Savannah, 30 years after I first went to Japan and wrote one of those letters home, 20 years after I set out to walk the Bible in my family story, 10 years after the birth of my children, and I'm pleased to say 8 years after I was first diagnosed with cancer. And I say to you, may you find a way to connect your family story with the oldest stories ever told. May you find a way not just to talk about the green and bountiful moments, but about the moments in exile, in the moments in desert, the moments of pain. And may you find a way to take your passion for family history and pass it on to subsequent generation, and especially to our children who need it in order to believe that they can have a life of passion that they can control with dignity, happiness, and togetherness. And I say to you, as someone who used to be the walking guy, who lost the ability to walk, but who can now walk again, every now and then, find a friend, take a walk, and share a story. Thank you very much.